Thank you very much. I should have added when I was talking to Daniel about what to say that the only qualification I have to speak to an air power conference is that I'm the editor of the journal Survival, which is, I'm not a defense expert, but it's embedded in, I'm among defense experts. So I've been asked, is the liberal world order as we know it collapsing? It's a dramatic question, and I don't promise a dramatically conclusive answer. I think the speaker before me was asked a question to which he said yes. I can't say that, but there's a strong sense that something bad is happening. And in my invitation to deliver this lecture, I was informed that the Norwegian Ministry of Defense has, for the first time, listed the threat to a liberal world order as one of the 4 significant threats facing Norway. And as a general proposition, I agree that there are signs all around us that the liberal order is fraying, if not disintegrating. So if it's not collapsing, it is threatened. Let me start with an attempt at a definition. What is the liberal world order? Some ingredients were suggested in my invitation: rule of law, open markets, multilateral institutions, liberal democracy, and leadership by the United States and its allies. I would add something which I'll call progressivism. By this I mean roughly left liberalism in the American sense or social democracy in a European sense. So not just an open society, but also a just society. I think it's important to put this forward because one of the arguments about the current moment is that liberal order is threatened, is failing precisely because it's seen to be unfair. Especially after the financial crisis of 2008, huge increases in wealth inequality have caused deep resentment among middle classes, and that resentment in turn has empowered populist politicians from America to Hungary in the transatlantic space, as well as authoritarian governments elsewhere. So even in what I would consider progressive democracies such as Austria, extreme right parties have now been normalized. Now, to be very clear, if what I call progressivism is a central ingredient of liberal order, so is conservatism. That is to say, a liberal conservatism committed to democracy at home and a liberal order abroad. After all, since World War II, the largest Western European states, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, have been governed by conservative parties more often than not. In the United States, somewhat surprisingly, it has been more evenly divided. If we just look at presidencies, which is complicated in a system like ours, but if we just look at presidencies, there have been 35 years of Democratic presidents and 36 years of Republican presidents. This is not counting the Trump administration for reasons I'm afraid I'll get into. So the Conservative Party in the United States has held the White House not for a majority of the time, but for about half the time. And I think this reflects an important fact of human nature. Most people, most of the time, are in fact conservative. They are risk-averse and loss-averse. We value most what we have and what we know. And so any progressivism or social democracy that doesn't respect that conservatism is unlikely to be democratic in spirit. And by the same token, I would argue, an enlightened conservatism comprehends the necessity for progress and social and economic justice, including a broadly distributed prosperity. Such was the ethos of conservative mid-century statesmen such as Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer. And in the United States, it was men like Dean Acheson, George Kennan, and General George Marshall, who were conservative in temperament and worldview, but who had worked for years in the New Deal administrations of Franklin Roosevelt and intuitively grasped that the antidote to communist gains in Europe and Japan was in effect a global New Deal. Such was the logic of the Marshall Plan, and by 1950 it was starting to work. It was this progressive conservatism that launched the liberal world order. And when I come to the end of my talk, I will try to show why this left liberal, right conservative consensus remains so important. Now I come to the difficult part of my talk, because I need to make an assertion that is shocking and possibly controversial, and I don't know, maybe in context of this conference, maybe it's even rude. So forgive me, but the assertion is that the biggest immediate threats to liberal world order are the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump and Brexit. Now, it's not very polite, and it sounds partisan to say so, but you know, as an analyst in purely objective and analytical terms, whatever President Trump is about, good or bad, it is certainly not about liberal order as we know it, which was the question I was asked to face, to discuss. You know, second, I suppose, sort of more analytically, it might be objected that in historical and in philosophical terms, I'm confusing cause and effect, and that furthermore, there are larger and deeper threats. There's the rise of China, a China that looks ever more threatening as we become ever more disappointed in the hope that semi-capitalist economic development would lead to a more liberal Chinese politics. And there are the Russian depredations under the banner of a kind of illiberal, reactionary, and authoritarian international. These are, to be sure, major potential threats. Xi's China is immensely richer and more advanced and more powerful than Mao's China. Indeed, it is arguably the only foreign power since the early 20th century that can be said to be about to be, I'm not sure exactly when, but even still in my lifetime, an actual peer competitor of the United States, which is hard to define, but let's just define a peer competitor as a power with the economic and military capacity to fight and conceivably defeat the United States in a protracted conventional war. In these terms, I'm not even sure that you would say that the Soviet Union was really a peer competitor, although obviously its power was greatly enhanced by nuclear weapons, by its positioning of tank divisions in the center of Europe, and initially by its ideological appeal. Post-Soviet Russia has obviously also threatened the liberal order by swallowing Crimea and nearly directly attacking other parts of eastern Ukraine. And yet the overwhelming advantage that Western champions of liberal order have had against both China and Russia, and for now continue to have, is the system of Western alliances. For perspective, it depends on how you count, but the United States has about 60 allies around the world. China has one ally, and I'm not sure Beijing really considers North Korea a net gain for its security or its international influence. Now, of course, increasing Chinese power could tip the balance somewhat, but it would be a massive failure of statecraft on the part of the United States to lose that many allies. In the case of Russia, with the attack on Ukraine in 2014, there was an immediate fear that Moscow, operating under the cover of political ambiguities regarding the treatment of Russian minorities in the Baltic states, could launch similar gray area attacks against one or more of those NATO allies. And if NATO had not reflected and responded, those fears would have grown. But in fact, NATO did respond, and it responded rationally. Since the Wales summit, the alliance has instituted a systemic range of measures. I realize in a military audience it's always inadequate, but in fact the alliance has instituted a systemic range of military measures to increase readiness and the credibility of its deterrence posture. Its responses have been, to quote a colleague of mine who really is a defense expert, logical, clear, and appropriate. So why then does France's President Macron call NATO brain dead? Well, I'm afraid it's obvious why, just as it's obvious that Macron is correct. The NATO alliance, if not brain dead, is in critical condition at its central nervous system core. Macron was speaking, remember, in early November, the month after President Trump's shock pullout from northern Syria, abandoning America's Kurdish allies, of course, but also giving no warning to French or UK special forces who were there with the Americans, and then saying directly and genuinely that it did not matter if ISIS reemerged because they would mainly threaten Europe, not America. And we now know that in the summer before this shock, President Trump was extorting the new president of Ukraine to announce a bogus investigation of nonsensical charges against the former vice president of the United States. Not only was the American president leveraging Ukraine's vulnerability against Russian attack for his own corrupt purposes, he was also recycling Russian propaganda to the effect that Ukraine, not Russia, intervened covertly to manipulate the 2016 presidential election in favor of Hillary Clinton rather than Donald Trump. As Trump's own former senior NSC director for Russia and Europe told the House Select Committee on Intelligence, this is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves. This is all without mentioning also in the last year or so the American violation of the JCPOA that it negotiated, creating a crisis with Iran where there was none, and acting like a rogue state with regard to climate change, which I want to come to at the end. Now, this stark account of President Trump's actions over just the past 6 months leads me to an important digression regarding American commitment to the American-led order in general and its treaty allies in particular. I live in Europe, and I hear from many Europeans what I consider to be a kind of false idea of continuity. It's understandable. As analysts, we look for deep structural reasons for things rather than surface political things. So what I consider a false idea of continuity is the idea that Trump is only the continuation of a trend, a more extreme version of Obama, for example, who was also disengaging from US global commitments. I would argue this is a false equivalence. Yes, there is an underlying American debate about its world role, and yes, some of our alliance relations need adjustment, as after the Cold War, the world has changed. I think of our relationship with Saudi Arabia in particular. But no one can really suggest that Obama was not committed to the values and principles of liberal world order, nor did he doubt that America had an important role in upholding those principles. Yes, he decided not to attack Syria after Syria's use of chemical weapons. We can argue about whether that restraint was a good or a bad idea. I actually think it was wise, but in any event, it doesn't carry the weight that so much analysis has for having begun the unraveling of the liberal world order. But there is in any event a huge difference between disengagement or rebalancing from certain strategic theaters where America was, in the judgment of many serious analysts, overextended, versus the forthright disavowal of the commitment and the values underpinning the Western alliance. That disavowal, pardon me that I can't pronounce the word, but that rejection is something new. No other post-war American president has done anything like it, even if they've all made serious mistakes. Now, the second immediate threat I spoke about was Brexit, and in sort of looking at my remarks before I took this stage, I realized I was going to run out of time. So I'm just going to try to move through this very quickly and summarize. Obviously, Brexit does not have to be a catastrophe. I stand here in Norway, which is not a member of the European Union, but has, I think, done a reasonable job in balancing its interests and its autonomy and its very close relationship with Europe. But it is The problem is it doesn't have to be a catastrophe, but the British leadership is making every effort to turn it into a catastrophe with a dogmatic refusal to understand economic consequences and economic power relationships. The EU is, and this is an argument I borrow from the Financial Times columnist Gideon Rockman, the EU is above all an alliance. It's an alliance, its power is shown, it's an alliance whose power is shown by the fact that when Britain faced off against Ireland in the Brexit negotiations, Ireland won. And that was because it had the alliance of the European Union behind it. And this is important when we're talking about the defense of the liberal order, because most of the challenges to it, and I think particularly the challenge from China, are not necessarily going to be military challenges. Most of what needs to be defended against China cannot be defended against military means. And again, standing here in Norway, I recall that when China threatened Norway over a Nobel Prize, it was not a military threat. So these two things together, Britain may come to its senses, but as I say, it seems to be driven by a surprisingly unpragmatic, un-Anglo-Saxon kind of dogmatism about the nature of English nationalism, really, and British autonomy. And these two things together are quite stunning. That is to say, the presidency of Donald Trump and Brexit, because the defection of the Anglo-Saxon powers, who were the liberal powers, who together, admittedly with the totalitarian Soviet Union, won the Second World War, and then constructed liberal order, or did so much to construct liberal order in Europe and globally, is quite a blow to that order. So I want to repeat, in case I wasn't clear a moment ago. Defending liberal order is not a matter of pursuing the toughest, most militaristic policies against presumed adversaries. Nuance and strategic balance is needed. Restraint is often wise. This cannot be emphasized enough. The Iraq War of 2003 was justified by American liberal and neoconservative interventionists in the United States and by Tony Blair-style liberals in the United Kingdom as necessary to defend the liberal world order against its challengers. And yet I would argue that you can draw a clear line from the failures of that war to the financial crisis of 2008. That's a complicated argument, but it's been convincingly made, to the presidency of Donald Trump, and very definitely to the Labour Party leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Without the Iraq War, Jeremy Corbyn would not be Labour Party leader, and without Corbyn as Labour Party leader, I'm pretty sure that Britain would not have left the European Union last Friday. I think part of the problem of the past 24 years, that is to say of the 21st century so far, has been to assume that liberal world order is universal, covering every person and every country on earth. That would be nice, but frankly, we didn't have such pretensions during the Cold War, and our modesty and our humility and our restraint, I mean, it was an enforced restraint, but it served us well. And I think we have to return to some first principles and an understanding of what was seen to be at stake for those who were present at the creation, to borrow from the title of Dean Acheson's memoirs. For Americans, what was at stake was first to make what was in the immediate aftermath of World War II, what was at stake was to make sure first that Europe, the source of two world wars in Acheson's lifetime, would be at peace with itself and so no longer threatening to world peace. And second, in a more American domestic context, to redeem the sacrifice of World War II by fulfilling the promise of Roosevelt's New Deal, and crucially, finally extending American political and economic equality to African Americans, so that the American Revolution was actually fulfilled, imperfectly fulfilled, about 2 centuries after it took place. Among Europeans themselves, plans for post-war order were inspired by what the Austrians called KZ-Kameradschaft, concentration camp comradeship. That's a specifically Austrian coinage, but the understanding was one that spanned the continent, and it included the post-war rebuilders of defeated fascist powers, as well as lands liberated from Nazi occupiers. And thus, Catholic conservatives and left socialists who fought against each other in the interwar years found themselves during the war, if they were lucky, thrown together as political prisoners of the fascists and came to a general understanding, a kind of moral covenant, that as survivors of the catastrophe, they had to work for something better. And what they agreed to work towards was a kind of liberalism. But there are, of course, ambiguities and tensions in that word, which I should have maybe mentioned in my introduction. These start with the fact that liberal has different meanings in Europe and the United States. In Europe, it can mean, in its reductionist version, capitalist. And of course, within this meaning, the post-war liberal order included an open, rules-based international trade regime. But in addition to the Bretton Woods institutions of international economic order, the post-war project rested also on extensive state planning for ambitious national welfare states. This was true not only in Western Europe, but also in the United States, where the word liberal connotes something closer to social democratic. In the conceptions of Bretton Woods, in the formation of NATO, in the reconstruction of Europe, in large measure under the Marshall Plan, and in the institutional beginnings of European integration, crucial leadership came from British labor rights and American New Dealers. And as I say, the continental Europeans who participated in the project included not only socialists, but also the conservative Christian Democrats who were in power for most of the years in which Europe's social democratic welfare states were built. So Catholic conservatives and social democrats in Europe were united with liberal Democrats and even Eisenhower Republicans in the US by a conviction that there was no going back to the arrangements of interwar Europe and Depression-era America, which were too often laissez-faire in domestic political economy and protectionist in international trade. Of course, it was complicated. A post-war regime of welfare, state planning, and open trade embodied the tensions that were in this hybrid kind of transatlantic concept of liberalism. To begin with, trade liberalization did not happen all at once. Stages and degrees of protectionism were deemed necessary to protect welfare states. But over time, the two meanings of liberal order were kind of bundled together. This process required conservatives to accept the state's responsibility for general welfare and socialists to embrace capitalist markets, including open international markets, as engines of wealth creation. And this social democratic compact was a centerpiece of the liberal anti-communist grand strategy for waging the Cold War. As George Kennan wrote in a 1948 lecture at the Pentagon, I'm quoting George Kennan here, in 1948, please recall, if economic recovery could be brought about and public confidence restored in Western Europe, if Western Europe, in other words, could be made the home of a vigorous, prosperous, and forward-looking civilization, the communist regime in Eastern Europe would never be able to stand the comparison. And the spectacle of a happier and more successful life just across the fence would be bound in the end to have a disintegrating and eroding effect on the communist world. Let me repeat, this was 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II, when George Kennan was director of policy planning at the US State Department. But the clarity of his understanding of how the liberal West would prevail 40 years later is simply astounding. Let me finish with one further remark. I said at the outset, or I meant to say at the outset, but Daniel beat me to it, that an important context of my remarks today is that I'm an American, and I always like to say this because I come from a UK think tank. It may also be relevant that I'm 61 years old, and I'm aware that there may seem to be elements of nostalgia in the lecture I just delivered. There are obviously new challenges and new threats that couldn't have been conceived by George Kennan in 1948. Climate change is the single biggest long-term threat to liberal order, and we can already see its malign feedback effects on conflict in the Middle East and refugee flows that are destabilizing the democracies of Europe. We need a liberal order to collectively combat climate change, and we need success against climate change to preserve liberal order. But that, I'm afraid, is another lecture. Thank you.
Sir, thank you so much for the epilogue. I think this was a great way to wrap up the day here in Lille Norge. And I know, as from our point of view, as cadets and future leaders in an ever-changing world, that this very subject is uttermost important to reflect upon. So, to show you our gratitude, on behalf of the Norwegian Air Force Academy, I want to give you this book, which is called, hold on, Political, Rational, and International Consequences of the War in Libya. Hope you as an author likes it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.